after we've had all these protests throughout the country and continuing protests to essentially demand more police accountability following the deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, there's now been basically a cultural backlash. And it's been a weird backlash, not really coming from the right, but coming from the left. And you're seeing cancel culture essentially a, it's taking on a life of its own. And we're seeing a lot of Hollywood liberals and production companies essentially trying to make amends for the sins of the past that were racially insensitive. And I'm looking at things like blackface. Now, blackface was always a controversial thing. It's never been appropriate. But even in a way to mock blackface, that's now being canceled. So, say for example, um, you have Jimmy Kimmel playing Oprah Winfrey and Karl Malone, and that happened in the late '90s, early 2000s on the Man Show. Um, Obviously, Jimmy Kimmel's not mocking blackface; he's actually in blackface playing characters. He's apologized for that. He's also apologized for allegedly using the N word in the comedy sketch while trying to imitate Snoop Dogg. You have Jimmy Fallon playing Chris Rock, and he was basically in the full, full blackface as well. And that was when he was on SNL in the late '90s, early 2000s. Um, 30 Rock, head writer Tina Fey, pulling 4 episodes that included blackface from NBC streaming, or essentially requesting that it be pulled because of the use of blackface. I haven't seen any. I've only seen like one season of 30 Rock, and I can't tell you if I ever came across the blackface episodes, but essentially those were pulled. Then you have Community, essentially pulling their episode on Dungeons and Dragons that included, I believe, Ken Jeong, the Asian actor and comedian, for dressing up in blackface but as an elf. Um, then The Office, they have blackface. Scrubs, The Golden Girls, and it's only a matter of time before they get Tropic Thunder, which came out in 2008. Hilarious film, um, and kind of a commentary on just how Hollywood operates as a whole. In fact, it's a very smart social commentary on how Hollywood operates because rather than going and hiring a black actor, they hire an actor played by Robert Downey Jr., who's Australian, and gets surgery to essentially uh, look and appear black. Um, and uh, I mean, like, people obviously can tell the difference between certain uses of blackface, like a Jimmy Kimmel or a Jimmy Fallon, to the blackface used by say Robert Downey Jr. But obviously, because he's in blackface, it's only a matter of time before that movie gets pulled from streaming and is outright canceled. But then it goes a step further than that. And this happens to do with like the war on cartoons. So like for example, The Simpsons, you have Hank Azaria leaving the character of Apu. This happened months ago, obviously, before the George Floyd protests, but it's just part of a string of, uh, you know, you know, generally speaking, white actors and actresses leaving roles where they're portraying cartoons of color. You have Jenny Slate stepping away from her character in Big Mouth, who's like a biracial, half Jewish, half black uh, girl by the name of Missy Foreman Greenwald. And then in Central Park, you have Kristen Bell stepping away from her mixed race character. In Family Guy, Mike Henry, the guy who voices Cleveland Brown, he's leaving that character. BoJack Horseman, Allison Brie, voicing an Asian character, Diane Huen, she's leaving that character. And that's not exactly blackface, but it is cultural appropriation. I mean, it's only a matter of time, really, before all of these slots are filled by just Scarlett Johansson and Scarlett Johansson alone. She's going to play every single character of color. And, Hollywood's going to complain. People will complain, but, like, she's just going to keep going on her merry way. Um, then you have things like changing Aunt Jemima and Uncle Ben's, which I get it. Those were based on, like, stereotypical depictions of black people used for, uh, essentially selling a product, maple syrup, rice, um, and while Aunt Jemima apparently she got profits, it's reported that she didn't get much. Um, and then Dungeons and Dragons moving on from like community to replacing the evil races like the orcs and the dark elves. You have bands changing their names. Lady Antebellum changing their name to Lady A. You have the Dixie Chicks changing their name to just the Chicks. And then slaves changing their name to, I don't know, Liberators. I actually don't know what name they changed theirs to. You have Oregon and Oregon State, two universities that play an annual football game in college football, uh, changing their name of the nickname of their game from the Civil War, as if the Civil War only applies to the American Civil War that was fought over slavery. Um, Seems a little much. Then you have Princeton University changing the name of one of its buildings from Woodrow Wilson, the president of the United States over 100 years ago, because of his racist thinking and policies. Woodrow Wilson, who, by the way, today is considered one of the most racist presidents and probably one of the worst presidents, despite the fact that he was overseeing the League of Nations, the defeat of the Central Powers in World War One. Of course, you can make a lot of criticisms about the League of Nations and the penalties that they essentially put on Germany that created a fascist despot dictator and Adolf Hitler, and the sort of global agreements and pacts that sort of led to this neoliberal agenda that we now see today, in which you have this competing ideologies of globalism and national populism, where Trump represents the national populism, and basically everybody else is a globalist. While beyond that, you have other Ivy League schools that are now being pressured to change their names from Yale and Brown and Columbia. Yale and Brown, who are, I guess, slave owning families or slave owning people. Columbia, which I imagine is named after Christopher Columbus. And then you have, obviously, Washington, D.C., which, while pushing for statehood, is looking to change its name to Washington, D.C., as the D.C. not District of Columbia, but D.C. Douglas Commonwealth, named after Frederick Douglass, the one of the most famous black abolitionists and authors and writers. Now, Washington, D.C. in the House, they approved a measure for D.C. statehood. It's obviously going to stall in the Senate. It's never going to happen. It's never going to get to the president's desk. And it's kind of crazy that even just naming it Washington Douglas Commonwealth, it's almost like Washington, who was a slave owner, George Washington, and Douglas, Frederick Douglass, an abolitionist. It's like they cancel each other out. So all you're left with is just Commonwealth. It's kind of silly, but okay. But I mean, at the end of the day, this is all about protecting their brands. It may very well end up that there are benefits to it. You might see diversification of many writing rooms and newsrooms and also some production studios. But it almost seems like these brands are more inclined to not be ostracized or canceled than they are to do the right thing. And it's sad because all of that coverage has completely eclipsed police reform, which was the original goal that these protests set out to do. Of course, a lot of these protests have set out to essentially take down statues of Confederate monuments and Confederate generals, and some have been torn down, but they've also moved to essentially slave owners. And slave owners include a lot of the founding fathers. You have George Washington, his statue being torn down in Portland, Oregon. You have Ulysses S. Grant, who, while was a slave owner, was the general of the Union Army that helped defeat. He was instrumental in defeating the Confederacy and obviously ending the institution of slavery with it. And as a result, then became president and helped smash the Ku Klux Klan. He owned a slave before the Emancipation Proclamation, and he freed the slave beforehand, before the Emancipation Proclamation. Um, and there are obviously competing reasons about why he did it. One was for economic reasons. One was because he thought it was the right thing to do, or he saw that saw writing on the wall that slavery was about to end, and that he should basically act now. Whatever the case may be, he was obviously instrumental in helping end the institution of slavery for good, like forever. Obviously, there's modern day slavery today, but not in the similar way that we see it from the pre-Civil War era. But the coverage has obviously been skewed more towards this cancel culture because it's sensationalist and it's around entertainment, and everybody enjoys these pieces of art and entertainment. But we've basically missed the boat on Democrats and Republicans dropping the ball here and not coming up with some level of police reform legislation. And it seems like because it's an election year, both sides gave in to political pressure internally. And, you can make the case that Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell wasn't bipartisan enough, that it was only Republicans who drafted the Senate bill. And it ended up getting blocked by Democrats. And then you can make the case that House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's rhetoric by accusing Republicans of trying to get away with the murder of George Floyd, that nothing was done. You can say that was a pretty contributing factor. Both sides are to blame here. It's political gridlock in Washington as usual. Tim Scott's bill, the Republican senator from South Carolina, he wanted to ban or limit no-knock search warrants, which was the cause, is what led to Breonna Taylor's death in Louisville, Kentucky. But after, going through the procedures, that got watered down to simply just calling on the Department of Justice to collect data on no-knock search warrants. So it wouldn't have solved the problem either way. Pelosi's bill, on the other hand, that included a ban on chokeholds and no-knock search warrants. It limited qualified immunity, which is essentially the immunity that police officers have when doing their job, and essentially it protects them from being held liable from lawsuits for doing their job. If any lawsuits were to happen, they make it to the police department. They wouldn't make it to the officer in particular. No agreement could be made on chokeholds, though. And that's kind of what spawned this whole Pelosi talk about Republicans are trying to get away with the murder of George Floyd. In the end of the day, politics kind of poisons the entire well here. You don't get police reform, and as a result, you get a change of the culture. And despite, say the 1994 crime bill that Joe Biden he authored and got passed in the Clinton administration, none of it will, I doubt Biden will take a similar approach this time around, considering that it's now almost 25 years later, almost 26 years later, and wokeism essentially reigns supreme. It's its own orthodoxy, and there's no salvation, there's no reward. It's only punishment, and punishment is basically canceling and ostracizing people. It's all about it doesn't reward people for ideological purity. It simply filters out ideological impurity. It filters out people's sins, their mistakes that they made in the past. People aren't allowed to progress from having, say, outdated or inappropriate opinions about certain things. It's not even like doing inappropriate actions. Say, like, for example, Chris D'Elia, who automatically doesn't have any say in any matter because it seemed like he was very predatory towards, say, young girls, underage girls, trying to groom them. And that's obviously abhorrent, and he should be condemned for it. Uh, but in certain things that are similar, that are not, uh, obviously these things are harmful, but only in the lens of, say, where we are right now as a society. Back then, no one made a stink of it. And if people did these controversial things back then, we as a society didn't rightly call it out because for some reason that was still acceptable to at least a majority of the crowd. Obviously, times have changed, and you're seeing that people nowadays aren't allowed to have opinions that they once held, even if they don't hold them anymore. Um, and what I mean by that is people aren't allowed to evolve and change their mind. And I think we as a country need to remember that people are constantly changing. We're constantly evolving our view of the world, our view of, perspective on everything, from politics, religion, how we should, treat each other. And it's been a weird but rude awakening.